Most people would consider me to be an atheist, although I don't identify with that label. I don't believe that God exists. For me, belief or disbelief are meaningless. The point is to know. I'm going to address the question of whether God exists in a very unconventional way. I'm going to give what I believe are the strongest arguments for the existence of God. I'm not going to use any of the classical arguments. I'm going to offer three that I think are fairly original and novel. I think I'll say some things that an open-minded person, whether they believe in a God or not, will find thought-provoking and intellectually stimulating, or at least amusing to listen to after a few drinks. To consider the question of whether God exists, you have to know what is meant by the word God, and what is meant by the word exist. The challenge we face up front is that these are two of the most difficult words to define. People mean all kinds of different things when they say God, and the question of what it means to exist is actually a harder philosophical problem than most people would imagine. I'm not trying to be funny here, but just to give an absurd example to illustrate my point, imagine that someone tells you that God exists, and you challenge them to prove it. They get out their wallet or smartphone and show you a picture of God, their dog. It turns out they've named their dog God. When they say God exists, they're just saying that their dog exists. Once you understand what they mean by God, you accept that God exists. So if you considered yourself to be an atheist before, you can't any longer, because you've admitted that God exists, at least this one God, which I guess makes you a monotheist. Obviously, this has nothing to do with what most people are debating when they argue about God's existence. But it's an important point to make, because before I can accept or reject belief in something, I have to know what that thing is. That's why I think atheism only makes sense if it's the rejection of a belief in a specific concept of God. I don't think it makes any sense to categorically deny the existence of anything that anyone might call God. Even the example of the dog named God would be enough to completely destroy atheism as a categorical denial of the existence of God. Before I get to my argument, I also need to say what's meant by exist. Most atheists tend to define existence in such a rigid way that they would be forced to deny the existence of many things that we know are real. I once challenged an atheist to prove to me that forests exist. He pulled out his phone to try to show me a picture of a forest, just like I had done to show him a picture of my dog named God. I told him I didn't see any forest. I told him I saw nothing but trees, and repeated my challenge to him to show me a forest. In the same way, I could say that the universe doesn't exist. There are stars and planets and black holes and all sorts of other things, but where is the universe? And to get really extreme with it, you could say that not only do forests not exist, but trees don't exist either. Because you can break the tree into parts, down to the level of cells and molecules, and then claim that only those parts exist while denying the existence of the whole. If you think this is absurd, that's my point precisely. My first argument for the existence of God is just this. I'm defining God as absolute being, as the whole which contains all of existence. All that exists falls somewhere in a hierarchy of categories. All the different plants fall under the category of plants. All the different animals fall under the category of animals. And all plants and animals fall under the category of organic life. Organic life, or organic matter, and inorganic matter both fall under the category of material objects. If there is such a thing as immaterial things, then both material and immaterial objects would both be subcategories within a larger category that included both. Ultimately, everything that exists falls under the category of things that exist. You might even say that the category of existent things and the category of non-existent things exist within a higher category heading that includes both. Logically, there is a category heading which all other categories are subcategories of. What else should we call this other than God? Do you have a better label for it? Absolute being? In any case, if that's what I mean by God when I say God exists, I don't think there can be any disagreement that God exists, unless you also want to deny the existence of forests, species of plants and animals, and pretty much anything that exists as a whole made up of parts, which is everything really. So to deny the existence of God is to deny the existence of everything by extension. Clearly, the argument I've given isn't an argument for the existence of the God of any religion. An atheist can't refute my argument, but they might try to argue that I'm wrong to use the label God to describe absolute being. First of all, who are they to tell anyone else how to define God? Many philosophers have used the word God in this way, so I'm perfectly justified in using the word in this way too. It isn't as if I'm changing the meaning of words. I'm using a word which has been given several very different meanings, and I'm clarifying which meaning I intend. Second, I'm the one making the truth claim here. I have the burden of proof, and I have the burden of defining what I mean. It's my definition of God that matters, not theirs. If they were debating a Christian, could they say that the Christian is wrong to define God as the Christian concept of God? So this is one argument for the existence of God. I don't think there's really any counter-argument to it. Once you understand what I mean by God, there's just nothing to deny. A reasonable person will say, of course I admit that God exists, if that's all you mean by it. If anything, they'll feel that it's a very boring and insignificant truth. I disagree with that. I actually think the existence of God, even defined in this way, is significant for philosophical reasons I won't go into now. But now I want to get into an argument for the existence of the kind of God that most people are more interested in. I'm going to offer my argument for the existence of the God of religion, the God of the Bible in particular. Again, I'm leaving all the classical arguments aside. The ontological argument, the moral argument, the cosmological argument, the presuppositional argument, Pascal's wager, and all the rest are completely uninteresting to me. They've all been refuted so many times in so many ways by so many people in so many debates that I feel a little embarrassed for anyone who still uses them. My proof hinges on clearly defining the word exists. No one who understands me will accuse me of twisting the meaning of words either. I'm only showing that there are different ways of existing. I've already given the forest example. Color offers another example. Does the color red exist? It's a subjective reality, but not an objective reality. It exists only as a perception in the mind of the perceiver. Red doesn't exist in the object itself. So we can talk about existence in an objective or in a subjective sense. Imagine a debate where one person was giving arguments for the existence of red as an objective reality, and the other person was arguing that red doesn't exist. Both would be wrong. The first person is wrong for mistaking subjective existence for objective existence. And the second person is wrong for failing to recognize the reality of red's subjective existence. A third debater is needed to make the case for red as a subjective reality, which does exist, but not objectively. This is how I want to frame this debate. And I'm playing the part of the third person. Most Christian apologists argue for the existence of God as an objective reality. Most atheists who debate them analyze this claim and find it unconvincing. And atheists always pose the challenge to religious believers in these objective terms. So each responds to the other in ways that flow out of a categorical error. Neither seems willing to consider God as being subjectively real. When I say this, a lot of atheists will agree and think that by agreeing with me, they've discredited theism. They tend to think that saying something is subjective is the same as saying it isn't real. But that isn't true, unless you don't think red is real. A lot of Christians think this way too, and so they'll get angry when I say that God exists as a subjective reality, because they also think that what exists subjectively is unreal, or that it's somehow less real than what exists objectively. I reject that notion. If anything, I believe it's the other way around. But let me back up for a second. When pressured to give arguments and evidence for their faith, religious people may do so. But whatever arguments and evidence they offer you are very rarely the reason why they believe in God. Just like I'm leaving aside the classical theist arguments, I'm also leaving aside the classical atheist arguments. So I'm not going to argue that they only believe what they believe because they were taught to believe it as children. I'm going to give them respect and accept that their faith is personal and genuine. Most religious people who have a deep faith base their faith more on personal religious experience. They'll say that they know God is real because God has revealed himself to them. As the hymn goes, "You ask me how I know he lives within my heart." I actually think this is the strongest argument for the existence of God, even though most atheists tend to scoff at it. I'll explain why I take it seriously. I don't want to take a giant detour to consider questions of epistemology, but I think most people will basically grant that we know things through our experience. Everything that we know is presented to us as experience. All of science is knowledge based on experience. It's empirical, in other words. Scientific knowledge tends to be concerned with what is observable and measurable. What scientific knowledge can we have that is outside of our experience? Sure, we might not be able to directly observe microbes or black holes, but we build instruments like microscopes and telescopes that allow us to observe things that would normally fall outside of human experience. A scientific-minded atheist will object to a religious person's subjective experience of God, though. He won't deny that the person had the experience necessarily. He won't necessarily say the religious man is lying. He'll just say that subjective inner experiences don't justify claims about objective outer reality. And this is true. But it's universally true. And this is a problem for the materialist as well. Everything you know about the objective outer world is based on your own subjective inner experience. You can't prove that a slice of pizza exists as an objective outer reality that exists independently of your mind. You only know it as an experience of your perception. You might object that you can see it, smell it, taste it, feel it, and maybe even hear it as you chew on it. But those are all perceptions. The pizza you know only exists in your mind. You could be dreaming that you're eating pizza. Your experience of it is still real, but you only know for sure that it's subjectively real. It may or may not correspond to an objective outer reality. But you can't prove any correlation between subjective reality and objective reality. This gets us into the problem of solipsism, which I don't want to deal with in depth right now. But the point is that for us to know anything at all, we have to assume that our experience is valid. If our experience doesn't tell us about reality, then we can't know anything about reality. So why would you privilege your experience of a slice of pizza over someone else's experience of God? This brings us to another important distinction about different kinds of reality. There is consensual and non-consensual reality. Consensual reality is made up of shared experience. Non-consensual reality is made up of personal experiences that are inaccessible to others. Usually, things that can be recorded and measured through the senses or with scientific instruments belong to consensual reality. This is the realm of the hard sciences. But to be precise, what we call consensual reality is really just consensual experience. It's still subjective. Since everyone shares certain experiences, we take this as validation that our consensual experience probably corresponds to an objective reality that exists independently of our individual subjective experiences. But we still can't prove it. Even if everyone in the world saw the pizza, smelled the pizza, touched the pizza, and tasted the pizza, assuming there are enough slices for everyone, each of them is only having a subjective experience. They're having mental perceptions. They can't prove that these mental perceptions correspond to an objective reality, though. Even if they get confirmation from other people that their subjective experience matches up with the subjective experiences of everyone else on the planet, there's no way to prove that everyone's shared subjective experiences correspond to any objective reality which exists independently of the mind of any perceiver. My point isn't to prove that there is no objective reality. My point is just that if you dismiss someone's subjective experience of God because they can't prove that their subjective experience corresponds with objective reality, someone could just as easily dismiss all scientific knowledge, which is based on human experience, on the same grounds. So the only counter-argument to the argument from personal religious experience is that it belongs to the realm of non-consensual reality instead of consensual reality. It's really nothing at all to do with whether it's a subjective experience or not, because all experiences are subjective experiences. And all knowledge is therefore subjective knowledge, because all knowledge comes through experience. The problem is, the atheist who is challenging the religious person doesn't share in their experience. But a blind person who doesn't experience the color red could challenge a seeing person to prove to them that the color red exists. And I don't see how this challenge could ever be met. Now, to be fair, a person who suffers from hallucinations might hear voices that no one else hears. These voices would be subjectively real for that person. But because that person's subjective experience doesn't match up with the subjective experiences of other people, it's generally accepted that the person is delusional. It's within the realm of possibility that these alleged hallucinations actually do correspond to objective reality, but that everyone else fails to perceive the voice. This is no different from imagining a world in which only one or a few people can see color. The people who see red will be thought to be delusional. They would be correct in saying that they experience the color red. The people who said that the color red didn't exist would be right too, in the sense that the color red doesn't exist objectively. They would be right in the sense that the color red wasn't part of consensual reality. But the fact that the color red would only exist as a non-consensual, subjective reality for one person or for a group of people would not in any way imply that red isn't real. We all acknowledge that the color red exists, and even a colorblind person doesn't deny the validity of another person's experience of the color red. Why should we treat religious experience differently? What justifies us in doing so? Of course, it's fair to point out that no one is suggesting the color red as an explanation for how the universe was formed. No one is using pizza as a justification for war, genocide, or genital mutilation. So that's worth talking about. But I don't think it in any way negates my argument for the validity of religious experience and for the subjective existence of God. It actually brings me to my third argument. But before launching into my third argument, let me close my second argument for the existence of God by admitting that my argument only argues for the subjective existence of God. It doesn't affirm or deny his objective existence. For religious people, that may seem unsatisfactory, and for atheists, that may seem weak. But I've also argued that nothing can be proven to exist objectively. So to say that I can't prove that God exists objectively is no admission of failure, any more than it is to say that I can't prove that the material universe exists objectively. So to say that God exists subjectively is to say that we know he exists in the same way that we know the universe exists. The impossibility of proving the objective existence of the universe to a solipsist is not seen by a materialist as a problem. So I don't see why the impossibility of proving the objective existence of God to a materialist is any more of a problem for the religious person. The argument from personal experience is a strong one when it comes to defending your personal faith, even if it isn't going to be useful in convincing other people who don't share your personal religious experience. My third argument for the existence of God is actually directed toward atheists. If anything, it's probably religious people who won't like this argument, but I think even they'll like it in the end. It builds in some ways on my second argument for the subjective existence of God. From there, I want to demonstrate the objective existence of God. Again, once I explain what I mean, I think there's not much to argue with. Let me start it out like this. Imagine that you've been shot. A real bullet has just hit you in the shoulder. The pain in your shoulder is real. The bullet is real. Does it make any sense to deny that the gun that fired the bullet, or the person who held the gun, was real? Clearly not. An imaginary bullet that can cause real pain in your shoulder is real as far as you're concerned. An imaginary gun that can fire a real bullet is real too as far as you're concerned. An imaginary person who can fire a real gun at you is also real as far as you're concerned. So let's just say that as far as you're concerned, the pain in your shoulder, the bullet, the gun, and the person who fired the shot are all real. What about the person's motive? Is the person's motive also real? If they shot you because they hate you, is their hatred also real? Well, if it isn't real, it still caused a real person to shoot you. So as far as you're concerned, their hatred or their inner motives are also real. If a candle that doesn't exist can light a dark room, the candle is real in any sense that matters to us. And I'm saying that God is real in the same sense. He is real because he manifests himself objectively in the world through the actions of human beings. This isn't to argue that this God is the eternal creator of the universe, though. You can't observe or measure the love of a mother for her child. In a sense, from a reductionist point of view, you might even say that love doesn't actually exist. I don't buy into reductionist arguments myself. I don't think that love is identical with electrical and chemical activity in the brain. I don't think consciousness is identical with neurons firing in the brain either. I don't pretend to be able to explain love or consciousness, but I don't need to be able to offer an explanation of it myself to know that the reductionist explanation is a failure. It isn't an explanation at all. It's a complete denial of the thing to be explained. But the thing to be explained isn't something that can be denied. We experience consciousness directly. We experience love directly. It's the very fact that consciousness exists that makes experience possible at all. So it's impossible to deny consciousness. Its existence is a self-evident truth, so I need offer no further argument. But back to the example. A mother's love for her child isn't a self-evident truth to an observer. She has a direct experience of love, but no one other than her does. Her love for her child only becomes measurable or observable through her actions. Her behaviors demonstrate her love for her child. This is the attitude of behaviorism. Behaviorists admit that they can't directly observe and measure subjective brain states. What is depression? I've never seen it. Show it to me. But we see behavior. From a behaviorist perspective, depression is basically a pattern of behavior. Even a neuroscientist is essentially still a behaviorist. For them, depression is a pattern of behavior in the brain. It's a pattern of brain activity. But for the person who is depressed, depression is neither of those things. It's an experience. It's a subjective reality. But no one else can see his internal state. They can only see the external manifestations of it. The external manifestations of his internal state of depression through his behavior is the only way they can know of its existence. Without external manifestation through behavior, depression, as a subjective reality, might as well be imaginary as far as anyone other than the subject is concerned. But even if you're a moron who denies the existence of internal, subjective experiential reality, you can't deny the external behavioral manifestation of it. And as I've stated, it's pointless to deny the existence of a gun that can shoot real bullets and cause real pain in your shoulder. So the argument for the existence of God is a simple one. Is God's subjective existence, which I've already established, manifested externally through behavior? The answer is yes. This God, who exists in believers as a subjective reality, affects their internal state and external behaviors, and manifests his will in the external world through them. Their faith, put into practice, is the evidence of things unseen. An atheist will object that it isn't God, but the person's belief in God that inspires their action. I think the arguments I've already made preemptively refute this objection. It isn't their beliefs that inspire their actions, it's their God. Their belief is based on their personal experience of this God. This God exists for them as a subjective reality. I've granted the subjective existence of their God already. I've granted that all we know about is subjective existence. Gravity exists for us subjectively. We can't prove that our experience of gravity corresponds to an objective fact about reality that exists independently of our experience. We believe that it does, but we don't say that it's our belief in gravity that causes us to land back on the ground after we jump. We say that gravity is the cause. So it isn't someone's belief in God that causes them to fly planes into buildings and kill innocent people. It's their God. It isn't someone's belief in God that causes them to feed the homeless. It's their God. Some people deny that Jesus existed as a historical person. Others say Jesus was a historical figure, but that the stories about him in the Bible are mostly legends. I'm not sure. I don't claim to know. My own view is that the Gospels are definitely at least mostly mythical accounts. But I'm open to the fact that there may very well have been a historical figure who the myths were added onto. But my argument is for the living Jesus. If someone says Jesus lives in their heart, I accept their claim as valid. I believe they are truthfully describing an inner experience. I'm willing to grant the subjective existence of Jesus. I don't think that this subjective experience corresponds to or proves the existence of a historical person who matches the description of Jesus in the Bible. But I'm perfectly comfortable with stating that Jesus lives. Christians have a relationship with Jesus. Yes, it's subjective, but as I've said, that doesn't make it less real in any way. He lives in them. He even has a physical body, in the sense that the church is the body of Christ, according to Christian beliefs. So Jesus exists. God exists, in the same way that you or I exist, and in the same way that the universe exists.